Everything changes and everything is connected. Sometimes we struggle to educate the community about climate change because we start with the science and we try to isolate if the change is brought about distinctly by the climate. And then we try to prove that climate change is caused by humans. And we do this because we try to convince unwavering nations and people to be accountable. But in the eyes of the poor, these are all changes that aggravate the existing poverty and inequality they experience every day. Instead of isolating climate change, we should start connecting it. Instead of talking about melting polar ice caps, let's talk about their growing indebtedness to rice traders and how they are forced to till the land using unsustainable practices because they apparently have no other choice. Maybe later we have the luxury to expand the conversation to land tenure, insecurity, unsustainable land use, food insecurity, trade liberalization, global warming. The point is, these are all connected, and if we do want action from people, we have to connect these issues to issues that matter to them. And the climate is one of those changes that we experience. From the extremes of super typhoons and extended periods of drought to shifting seasons and hotter summers. All of these affect us differently, some far worse than others. The climate changes due to natural causes and through different seasons. However, these changes are accelerating due to human activities, especially with generations increasing carbon dioxide emissions. Global warming has caused direct impact, such as increased temperature, increased or decreased rain, more intense and frequent meteorological hazards, sea level rise, etc. These have caused countless indirect impact on the environment and humans. Further, there are also impacts caused by the responses made by people to adapt to and to mitigate climate change. Will the decrease in economic activity due to the pandemic stop climate change? It will definitely help, but the climate change impact we are currently experiencing is caused by the greenhouse gases in the atmosphere that were emitted decades ago. We will likely experience the respite in climate change years from now, but this can be negated if there is a sudden surge in economic activity to return to the previous normal after the pandemic. From something very complex and confusing, climate change has become anything and everything to everyone. Every major disaster has been blamed to the environment. One of my midterm exam question is, how does blaming everything to climate change reduce resilience? Hopefully, you will be able to easily answer this question after our lessons in resilience and climate change. There are several local drivers of climate change, even here in the country. From the changing land use and land coverage, to the massive biomass burning, to the urban air pollution, to the growing urbanization. But before we discount the problem as another problem of indiscriminate lifestyle of humans versus the environment, before we start looking down at the poor struggling to make a living from overfished fishing grounds, harvesting wood from whatever is left of our forests, and crawling into tiny holes in small-scale mines, we have to recognize that carbon footprint of people are not the same. The richest 1% are responsible for double the carbon emissions of the poorest 50% of the world. The climate emergency is an issue of inequality and injustice. We have to pay attention to the nature of the change. Some change may be fast, but often these are reversible change, like extreme rainfall or more frequent strong storms. And some changes are slow, but often these slow change is irreversible, like increasing temperature and ocean acidification, sea level rise, shifting seasons. Just like the illustration where you have the frog jumping out from the boiling water and the frog enjoying a hot summer bath with the slow changing temperature of water. The same thing happens to us. Much work and attention are being done on the fast, reversible change through disaster risk reduction. The effects are visible and felt especially by people in or near hazard-prone areas. However, the slow, irreversible change does not as easily mobilize action from authorities or affected communities. Rare are the elected officials who will prioritize investments for their constituents that will benefit their political successors. The projected direct change in the climate is described by scientists as the changes in temperature, rainfall, and extreme events. In the Philippines, there is a projected increase of 1.8 to 2.2 degrees Celsius. The higher ends will be experienced during the summer months and mostly in southern Visayas and Mindanao. These figures may seem small compared to the doomsday projection of 3 to 4 degrees Celsius globally. However, recall that we are a tropical country. Our flora and fauna do not have a wide range of tolerance like those in temperate countries who experience extreme summers and extreme winters. A slight change in temperature can already wipe out the population of a specific species in the tropics. For rainfall, we expect drier summers. During the Habagat season, Luzon and Visayas may experience wetter conditions, but Mindanao is expected to be drier. During the Amihan season, we expect it to be wetter everywhere, especially in the eastern side of the country. For extreme events, expect more frequent hot days over 30 degrees Celsius, more dry days, and more heavy rainfall days. In other words, expect the normal days to be much fewer. What is interesting in these projections is that the change is not uniform. The challenge is to gather downscaled information and projections and determine the implications of climate change to the locality. I previously had a partner NGO in Mindanao conducting field school experiments for their crops and introducing duck raising as a climate change adaptation livelihood. These innovations may be up to date since they have been experiencing floods lately, but these may be due to the engineering interventions on the waterways made by large-scale mining operations upstream. With climate projections to be drier and not wetter in Mindanao, these innovations by the NGOs are relevant to the community because of the increased risk brought about by mining and not by the climate. In this slide, we see that future vulnerabilities vary per sector. While there are opportunities, the detrimental impacts heavily outweighs them. Moreover, for every identified impact, countless indirect impacts affect the environment and the population, especially the vulnerable communities. I attended a workshop in Zamboanga City where scientists shared downscaled climate projections. The data and the maps produced were amazing, but when the different stakeholders started to draft their vision for the city, I realized that it's not easy to understand the implications of climate change, even if the data is already there. Local city planners shared the vision of investing on shrimp culture and expanding the seaweed culture, primarily because of recent proposals of foreign investors coming into the city. These were economic investments that were vulnerable to diseases brought about by increased water temperature, the main findings of the climate projections. So we can only project how these projects will fail and how the poor whose hopes have been tied to these investments will again be disappointed. Globally, several mitigation and adaptation proposals have been put forward by scientists. Many of these are not new, and many of them align with calls for sustainable development. It it is clear that actions needed are not limited to climate change, adaptation, and mitigation, but to more holistic sustainable development, poverty and inequality reduction, and well-being strategies. Often, we also get lost in the different overlapping strategies. Disaster risk reduction overlaps with the reactive disaster response through disaster preparedness. Climate change adaptation overlaps with disaster risk reduction during changing climate extremes and in the goal for vulnerability reduction. Climate change mitigation overlaps with climate change adaptation in the long-term adaptive capacity building of communities. Climate justice overlaps with climate change mitigation and climate change adaptation in the advocacy for reparation for affected countries. Climate change and disasters are the sexy issues nowadays. Every call for proposal in the Philippines looks into climate change and disaster risk reduction. Only recently has there been a rise in human rights violation concerns. My main issue here is that the Philippines' relevance in the international development community relies on disasters and the impacts of climate change. Some NGOs are even praying that disasters happen so that there are more resources coming in for DRR. If we believe that the issues should be determined by the people affected, and if we ask the poor what are their issues, the answers may not be climate change or disasters. In fact, for the urban poor, disaster risk reduction is a threat since there's a loophole in the Urban Development and Housing Act that they can be displaced, evicted, and their houses demolished if they live in a danger zone. If we ask the poor, the key issues are poverty and inequality, and climate change and disasters are issues because they aggravate poverty and inequality. The impact on urban and rural poor communities are different in the same way that the impact to men and women and other vulnerable groups are different. For rural areas, the main impact is in their livelihoods. It is said that the primary adaptation of the rural poor communities is to migrate to the cities where their livelihoods are not vulnerable to climate change. This is also why more climate change adaptation practices are more developed in rural communities, while in cities, most of the actions are concentrated around disaster risk reduction only. While our carbon emissions is globally insignificant, it does not discount the fact that both rural and urban communities emit greenhouse gases. Urban areas are considered as climate drivers with the high demand for energy, high levels of pollution, and the proliferation of what Pope Francis calls the throwaway culture. On the other hand, there is a concerted effort to hide the large carbon emissions from agriculture since it will damage the livelihoods of the rural poor. While we do hear about great strides in research and innovations on climate mitigation and climate adaptation, some of the more prominent issues are anti-poor development and maladaptation practices. In urban communities, we hear about far-side relocation of urban poor communities, reclamation projects in Manila Bay, and dike projects in Tacloban City that are supposed to protect the urban poor who will be displaced by the project itself. In rural areas, we hear about the Kaliwa Dam, which is supposed to address the water crisis at coal-fired power plants in rural areas. Because of the magnitude and global demand, climate change mitigation and adaptation interventions are also inevitable. If communities are not prepared to address these, they will again be vulnerable to anti-poor knee-jerk solutions and maladaptation practices that are determined mostly by government and the private sector. This is the new normal of development aggression. Any questions?